All right, well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you everybody for coming tonight. I'd like to take the next 15 minutes or so to talk about some physiology and some exciting research that we're developing here that revolves around how we get oxygen into our bodies, into the tissues that require it. So to start, I'd like you to consider that over your lifetime, you'll breathe about 700 million times. And each one of those breaths is designed to bring air and oxygen in from the environment around us, and then have that oxygen diffuse through the lung and into the circulation. At the same time, over our lifespan, our heart will beat about 3 billion times. And each time our heart beats, it moves blood throughout the body, carrying with it oxygen to critical tissues. Now, sitting here or in our daily lives, getting enough oxygen into our bodies and getting it to the tissues that require it isn't that difficult. However, many of us, and in fact, I believe most of us, will probably experience in our life some sort of situation or scenario where getting oxygen into our body and to the tissues that requires it becomes more difficult. And so I want to take a couple slides here just to outline some of these scenarios. So firstly, we can think of our environment. We know that as we travel to higher altitudes, the amount of oxygen that becomes available to us decreases. So sitting here in this room, there's a certain amount of oxygen, but as we climb, and by the time we climb, to the extent of human endeavor, Mount Everest, there's about 75% less oxygen available to us. However, along the way, there are many circumstances where modest decreases in oxygen may actually be occurring as well. So even an aircraft cabin is only pressurized to about 2,200 meters. And here, there's about 20% less oxygen. And so each and every one of us will probably at some point experience those modest decreases. At the same time, we can consider our activities. Exercise, for example. We know that when we exercise, we need oxygen going to our tissues, to our muscles. We know that as our work of exercise increases, we need more oxygen. And usually, in terrestrial type sports, this isn't much of an issue. However, I want you to consider those individuals that may take part in aquatic sports. Here, if you're exercising or exerting yourself underwater, you're using up oxygen in an environment where you're not breathing. And so this utilization of oxygen without bringing in additional oxygen puts us in a scenario where we may become limited. And finally, I want us to think about our health, or health-related disorders. And so respiratory disorders, asthma, sleep apnea, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, lung cancer, these are types of disorders where our ability to get oxygen into our lungs and then through our lungs into the circulation may become impaired. At the same time, cardiovascular disease, any sort of disease where there's a limitation, a narrowing, a clot, a blockage, it may prevent blood and the oxygen that's carried in that blood from getting to tissues that require it. And so in severe circumstances, we can think of situations such as stroke or a heart attack, where our brain and our heart don't get enough oxygen for the functions that they require. Now, I've given you a brief outline of some of the scenarios where we might encounter a decrease or a limited amount of oxygen, but what I want to talk about for the rest of this talk this evening is about how we respond to those situations, how our body responds, adapts, or compensates when oxygen may be limited. So how do we respond? Well, first of all, one of the first things is an increase in breathing. Increasing breathing draws more air and with it oxygen from our environment into our body. And then it can be passed into the circulation and then distributed. At the same time, our heart begins to beat faster and circulating that blood faster to the tissues that need it. Now, these are interesting responses and critical in the development of a response to decreased oxygen. But I'm interested in what happens next. Once oxygen enters the body, how do we get it to the actual tissues that require it? How do we distribute blood flow and oxygen? And so part of the research that I do in my lab involves interrogating the blood flow and oxygen delivery to different tissues. And we use ultrasound modalities and some other non-invasive devices, and we can look at the distribution and the delivery of blood and oxygen to a variety of tissues, muscle, organs, and the brain, for instance. But we're also interested in the optimization of that delivery. So not just how it's occurring on an everyday basis, but now when oxygen becomes limited, how do we change blood flow to these organs? How do we optimize the delivery of blood flow and oxygen? And part of that comes down to redistributing blood to where it's needed most. So in situations where oxygen may become limited, you need to redistribute blood from your extremities, from your fingers, from your toes, and move it towards places where it's needed more. Your heart, your brain, your organs, those places where oxygen is critical for life. Now, there's a very faint audio track here, but what it is, and what you would have been hearing there, was actually a conversation between a part of the nervous system and your vasculature. This is the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is responsible for your fight or flight response. It becomes activated under stressful situations. For instance, right now, as I'm giving this talk, I know for a fact my sympathetic nervous system is more active. But importantly, under conditions such as low oxygen, the sympathetic nervous system serves a very important role to regulate where blood flow goes to. Okay? And as part of that regulation, I'm interested in understanding how this conversation or how this discussion between the sympathetic nervous system and the vasculature occurs. And so to do this, part of the methodology that we use in our lab is a technique of microneurography. And what this is a technique where we can directly sample or directly record signals, the bioelectrical signals from the nervous system. And what we can see here is an individual on a table. This is their leg, and we have a needle electrode inserted into their perineal nerve, and below that is a representation of the neural activity that's ongoing in this individual. I've highlighted some aspects of this tracing to illustrate that this activity is going on continually as we're sitting here or in any number of other situations, but it occurs in kind of a bursting or intermittent pattern. Okay. Now, I like to think of this signal as a language of sorts, and you can equate it perhaps to Morse code. If you look at the signal a bit closer, what you can see are these impulses, these bursts of activity occur, and they're interspersed by periods of silence. And so our conventional understanding is that during these impulses, these bursts of activity, the nervous system is sending a signal to the vasculature to vasoconstrict, to squeeze, to move blood from one part to another. Now, this is our conventional understanding, but part of the research that I've been conducting and am conducting now has to do with investigating this signal further, looking at this language and trying to interpret it further. And through some novel techniques and analysis, we've been able to uncover novel interpretations of what is going on in this conversation. For instance, we know that there is a signal that's being sent out to the blood vessels to squeeze, but every once in a while, the neurons that are within this nerve become more excited, they become more emphatic, and now it's squeeze. And that occurs on an ongoing basis. And if we look at this closer, what we have here now is a representation of the electrical activity representing a group of neurons. Okay? And this group of neurons is participating in this conversation under normal oxygen conditions. And we know that if we decrease the amount of oxygen, that these neurons become more excited, they become more emphatic, and now the signal becomes elevated. But what we're also uncovering is that not only is the signal more emphatic now, additional neurons are joining the conversation. They're providing additional information to help provide an additional level of regulation and a different level of control to redirect blood flow to where it's needed. And so moving forward from this type of analyses, what we want to do is put this conversation into context. How is it that the nervous system controls its own regulation, conveys that to the vasculature, and how then, through the measures that we're making with our ultrasound systems, is that turned into a vascular outcome to redirect blood flow? Now, furthermore, and fundamentally, we're interested in what the functional implications are. So what does that mean at the level of the actual tissue? And so I bring it back to this idea that if you cannot get enough blood flow to tissues, if you cannot deliver enough oxygen, then there can be dire consequences. And so through some novel collaborations with individuals here and other universities, we're starting to develop techniques that are able to look at the actual functional implications at the level of the muscle. Now, what you're seeing here is a video of capillary and skeletal muscle in a rat. And this is from an experiment we did about a week ago. Now, if you look from the top to the bottom, you can see lines of capillaries running along the screen. And within those lines, you can see individual little dots that are tracing their way down. And these individual little dots are red blood cells carrying oxygen to the tissue. And I'd like you to take a note of what the scale is here. This is an illustration of an area about 800 microns cubed or squared. That's 8 times larger than a human hair. But functionally, for this tissue, this is where all of the exchange of oxygen to subserve biological processes occurs. And using some other analytical techniques, what we can actually do here is we can look at the amount of oxygen that's bound to the hemoglobin on these red cells. So now, if we track a red cell as it transits across this volume, we can actually look at how oxygen moves from that red cell into the tissue. This here is a representation of a volume of tissue now. And I don't want you to worry about the numbers in particular, but know that red means more oxygen in the actual tissue, and blue means less. And so under normal oxygen conditions, we see some variability, but the tissue itself is relatively well oxygenated. Now, if we take this same animal, the same section of tissue, and we expose the animal to less oxygen, 75% less, or 25% less oxygen, taking them to an arterial saturation of about 75. This is about an altitude of about 4,000, 4,500 meters. So it's not extreme. But what we can see here is that the blue regions become larger, the red regions become less. And what this means is that there is less oxygen being delivered to this tissue. And if you consider that any given tissue requires a certain amount of oxygen to subserve all of the biological processes that occur within it, if you reduce the amount of oxygen that's being delivered by 25%, that means something is not getting done. And so this has functional implications in terms of how this tissue then responds or acts or functions. And so together, the research program that I've put together has to do with how we get oxygen through our body, how we regulate the optimization of where blood flow and the oxygen goes, but then what the functional implications are at the level of the tissue. And so over the next 30 years, I hope to pursue this line of research to come up with some of the answers in terms of how do we actually regulate oxygen delivery and how that might be important under a number of different physiological conditions and situations that we may come across in our everyday lives. And so, thank you very much for your time. I'd be very happy to take questions.
So if we could dim the lights a little bit, just so that we have a better chance to interact with the audience. We'd be great to take some questions. I'd actually like to ask the first question if I can.
Sure.
Well, I'm interested in hypoxic training. It's something that was all